Happy Thanksgiving, Brian Windhorst. We'll get to you in just a minute. To the association we go. Time for a quick take. The Celtics beat the Bucks last night, but this moment between Giannis and head coach Adrian Griffin has people talking. Giannis downplayed it after the game. Windy, is this something or nothing?
This is something to watch because, look, in the last decade, we've seen 3 first-time head coaches win the title. Steve Kerr, Tyronn Lue, and Nick Nurse. It's not, just because you have a first-time head coach doesn't mean you can have success. But when you have a first-time head coach, there's a whole set of challenges. And I'm not sure Adrian Griffin is passing with flying colors. He had his lead assistant quit right before the start of the season. He's openly admitted that he's been browbeaten into changing his defense by his players. Now, players interacting with their coach and suggesting changes happens everywhere. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And then we have here, star player debating about coming in and out of the game happens in the NBA every night. But the disrespect that Giannis showed here, it's not a great feel right now, Stephen A., with where the Bucks and Adrian Griffin are in his first couple months on the job.
Why is the disrespect? Just to articulate for me, Wendy, I don't know what you mean that the disrespect, when you say Giannis showing the disrespect.
You don't yell at your coach at the scorer's table. You don't yell at your coach at the scorer's table.
I'm sorry, maybe I'm wrong, because you was watching the game more intensively than me. I was going back and forth between a bunch of stuff last night, but I watched some of the game. But I got to tell you, I didn't see him yelling. Did I miss something?
Well, this is very clearly not a comfortable conversation, and he's very clearly showing his coach up by refusing to go to the bench. It's not ideal.
Okay, yeah, I didn't realize he was refusing to go to the bench. My bad. So here's what I would say to you. Adrian Griffin, I hope you're watching. Happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. You waited years. You were assistant coach in the league for nearly a decade. You waited a lifetime for an opportunity like this. And not everybody gets to coach Giannis Antetokounmpo, a champion, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, an NBA Finals MVP, considered one of the top 2 to 3 players on the planet Earth. I suggest you pump the brakes. Because Adrian Griffin, if you are listening, I assure you the Milwaukee Bucks will cancel you in a heartbeat if Giannis wants them to do so. You better watch yourself. Now, it's not a threat. It's just words of wisdom coming from somebody like myself, Wendy, and you, who've been covering the NBA for decades. These kind of things that you want to get yourself fired as a rookie coach, okay? This is the way that you do it. I covered the Philadelphia 76ers in Randy Ayers' first year. And obviously, I thought Randy Ayers was a damn good coach, particularly at Ohio State before he came into the NBA as an assistant. Obviously, took over after Larry Brown. Decided to move on to the Detroit Pistons. He lasted about 51, 52 games because Billy King, then the president of basketball operations, decided to go in a different direction. Randy Ayers, obviously, they felt like didn't resonate with the players at that particular moment in time, and a very good guy. You didn't see this kind of stuff happening, but I remember when Glenn Big Dog Robinson wasn't perceived as having the greatest relationship, and Billy King decided to go in a different direction, which I absolutely abhorred and I was ticked off about. But in the end, I think it sends the kind of message that people are talking about. When you have stars on the team and they ain't vibing with a first-year head coach, they will bounce that coach out there in a heartbeat, Molly and Wendy, in a heartbeat in the NBA, more so than in other sports. In the NBA, they will do it. Adrian Griffin better be very, very careful, or he'll be out of a job sooner than he can say his last name.
All right, let's get to another superstar with clout. That'd be Kevin Durant. He had 32 points, leading the Suns to a win over the Warriors, but Wednesday's game added another incident to the long conflict between Golden State's Chris Paul and referee Scott Foster when Paul was ejected after Foster slapped him with 2 quick technical fouls. It was Paul's 7th career ejection. Here's CP3 postgame.
It's personal. Yeah, we had a situation some years ago, and it's personal. I got to do a better job making sure I stay on the floor for my teammates, but it is what it is. I'm sure I'll see him in a Game 7 soon.
All right, marinate on that for a second. Wendy, break this down for me. What is your reaction to this ongoing saga we have between CP3 and Foster?
Okay, so Scott Foster is one of the most valuable officials the NBA has. And the reason he is because he will make any call, anywhere, against anybody, at any time. And to have a guy who's not afraid to call a foul in a Game 7 on the home team is valuable. But like all of us, Scott Foster is flawed. And his flaw is that he allows his ego to get involved in situations. His ego is probably what enables him to be such a good official. But we have seen this repeatedly throughout his illustrious officiating career, not just against Chris Paul. Stephen A., there was a game last year involving the Toronto Raptors where he ejected Scotty Barnes at the end of the game, and it was a jaw-dropping ejection. It made absolutely no sense. This happens. Scott Foster rides the line, and this happens. In the case of Chris Paul, this particular situation here illustrated why I'm not sure that the NBA should have Scott Foster officiate Chris Paul games anymore. And I know why the NBA always has, because if you don't do that, it indicates a white flag. It indicates that your system doesn't work. But Scott Foster couldn't keep his composure here. Now, Chris Paul is legendary for the tricks of the trade and tweaking this and tweaking that. And Chris Paul at times has been guilty of antagonizing many people in this league, including officials. And he antagonizes Scott Foster here. But it is not Chris Paul's responsibility to keep his composure. And you can see in this interaction that there is a moment where Scott Foster turns his shoulder and loses his composure. Now, I don't put much credence in the playoff record with Scott Foster and Chris Paul. And that playoff record is 3-17. Chris Paul's teams are 3-17 when Scott Foster officiates in the playoffs. Let's just say that right now. My former colleague, your former colleague at ESPN, Tom Haberstroh, looked up the numbers, Stephen A. 15 times Chris Paul's teams were favored in those games, 3-17. I have been at many of these games. I was at the game this last spring where Chris Paul's Phoenix Suns won against the LA Clippers, breaking the 13-game losing streak. I have never felt that his officiating against the team has affected the outcome of the game. And it affected things here. And so I would just say that after watching this and in Scott's inability, as great of as an official that I believe he is, his inability to keep his composure here probably to me is the tipping point where you just need to move on from these two on the same court.
I totally agree with you on that last point. They do need to move on. They don't need to be on the same court together. And listen, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, where I do disagree with you is that you're not favored in 15 of 20 games and you're going 3-17, and it has nothing to do with the officiating. That's not an accident. That's too big, too glaring of a coincidence to ignore. 20 games, you're 3-17.
It's a compelling stat.
You're 3-17, and in 15 of those games, you're favored. And Chris Paul is telling you that the man, it's personal. It's personal. Now, let's understand who we're talking about when we're talking about Chris Paul here, okay? We're talking about one of the greatest point guards in the history of basketball. You can slice it any way you want to. He's not a champion. We get all of that. Chris Paul, considering his physical stature, playing a below the rim, being a quote-unquote quintessential point guard, is one of the greatest point guards in the history of basketball. Incredibly brilliant, a basketball savant. Here's the problem. He's such a basketball savant that he can highlight better than most the mistakes officials make. So because of that, if you're an official, you can have a player whining and moaning and complaining. That's not Chris Paul. Chris Paul is complaining, but if you ever talk to Chris Paul, which obviously I have, you have, et cetera, Chris Paul will grill you. He don't just make statements. He comes at you with questions. He comes, how did you make that? Explain to me how this happened. Did you know this rule? Did you know that rule, et cetera? He literally interrogates you. So if you're an official and there's a hiccup in your game in any way, figuratively speaking, he will expose you, and he will spend the game calling you out because he wants you to get things right. That's how he is. So in that regard, it could be incredibly frustrating. For a guy like Scott Foster, who's been around for ages, who's widely and universally respected in terms of his capabilities, the one blemish he has on his career is that it is clearly personal with Chris Paul. There is no denying it. And you saw it there again last night. Now, I don't agree with Chris Paul that there's going to be some Game 7 they'll see again, because based on what I'm seeing from the Warriors, you'll be lucky to make it to a damn Game 5. They really need to turn their season around. Make no mistake about that. But the flip side to it is that there is no getting around the fact that Chris Paul is making very, very valid points about personal animus that exists. And here's the difference between Scott Foster and guys from the past like Joey Crawford and Steve Javie and folks like that. If it were personal, they'd let you know. They let you know ahead of
Yeah.
time. You didn't have to figure it out. You didn't have to search. You didn't have to find out from a third party or whatever. They told you to your face, this is what it is. At least you understand what you're dealing with. The problem with Scott Forster, in my opinion, is that Scott Forster tries to give the impression of pristine professionalism when it comes to Chris Paul. And that's not the case when it comes to Chris Paul. He's not pristinely professional when it comes to Chris Paul. It's personal.
Yeah.
He's not objective. He can get subjective. And Chris Paul clearly gets on his nerves, and he's shown it from time to time. And that's why I think that Chris Paul needed to point out what he pointed out last night, and the NBA needs to do something about it, because I'm here to tell you, Molly, Scott Forster, no disrespect. I understand that Chris Paul ain't Steph Curry, he ain't LeBron James, but I'll be damned if we ain't come to see him more than we came to see Scott Forster. These officials ejecting players, having no regard for the paying customer who came there to see a damn basketball game, need to get checked. Scott Forster does not need to be on the same court as Chris Paul moving forward.